even wine. I give talks on wine history. You can just see people taking a deep sigh of expressing contentment and satisfaction that they're hearing their own culture coming back at them. And they appreciate it and they enjoy it. And those audiences historically, maybe a slight majority would have been for Scottish independence because they know that's what I stand for. But huge amounts of them will have been Scottish Unionists who would have voted no. In other words, even among latent Unionists, there is still an identity with Scottish culture. And maybe that brings us back to that other thing about the cultural confidence. If you can get enough people with the cultural confidence to engage with no voters and give them aspects of their culture that they love and identify with, I think that could help turn them round from political no voters into yes voters with the cultural confidence that can help bring.
I tend to agree. I think cultural confidence is one of the most important factors here, but there's also people that will tell you that, if you look at the polling and the data, most people voted on what they perceived as an economic reality, even though the way the economic picture was painted during the referendum wasn't entirely true, given, the stuff about losing pensions and so on, which simply wasn't true. But where do you think it plays in? Is it the two things have to go hand in hand? One's more important than the other, the economic and the cultural aspect of it? I think there's three. There's economic, cultural and political. Do you think they all have to go together, or one's more important than the other?
Well, from my point of view, it's the culture that ultimately is the most important. That's why I'm a Scottish nationalist, is because I value the culture, the music, the literature, the philosophy, etc., etc., the things that have been neglected in our education and media. But I realise there are many people who don't share that, who think that the economic is the most important argument. It's not for me, but I think that the more confident culturally you are, and the more you know about Scottish history and culture, and the more you read Scottish literature, the more likely you are to think that the economic argument is not the most important one. It's the cultural argument. It's the fact that we want to be normal, like every other country in Europe that naturally promotes its own culture. And naturally, the people who make decisions about the economy and the politics are people who put Scotland first.
When you say normal as well, one of the things, I've travelled around a bit in Europe and also in Asia, and one of the things that makes Scotland unusual, and this actually goes for the United Kingdom as a whole as well, but the lack of knowledge about local history and things that have gone on in that area is very unusual in Britain. Like, you go to other places, you go to Italy and you go to France, and they'll be able to tell you what's happened in that village 300 years ago and who lived here and who lived there. And I find in Britain that's much reduced compared to other places. I don't know if you agree with that.
I think it depends a lot the type of place it is and whether there is a strong local culture that has not had mass migration out of it, for example. So there are places like that. People my age will say that the young people don't know anything about their history and culture nowadays. So it just depends. Where Scotland is unusual is that, in a way, your working class identity, for example, among the masses who are working class, that kind of political cultural identity, with me, it was through the poetry of Burns, it was knowledge of Keir Hardie in Ayrshire, it was the Covenanters. There's a great example of that where I come from in Galston, where during the lockouts of 1922 and 1926, the miners of Galston built a cairn, a monument up on the top of the Irvine Valley, and it was to the Covenanters who were shot by the dragoons of Claverhouse back in the killing times against the Covenanters, the local men, the local farmers, back in the 1670s. And they were linking their struggle as miners in the early 20th century with the struggle for religious freedom in the 1670s and making a direct example of that. Now that was part of my working class history in Dalston, New Mills and Darwell in the Irvine Valley in Ayrshire that I inherited through my dad being interested in local culture and history and passing that on to me. And the older generation of miners in Dalston being very proud of that kind of history. So I got that, but I didn't get it very much at school, or I got it a little at primary school, and then when secondary school came on, it tended to be English and British and imperial history. And that's another fascinating thing, the whole myth about England and the Empire taking civilization first to Scotland and then round the world. And I've got a series going out just now called Scotland's Black History, which is Scotland's involvement in Africa and the Caribbean, and the terrible crimes that were made against people, especially in West Africa, under the auspices of the British Empire, are just horrendous. The Scots managed some saving graces within that horror because of people like Laws of Livingstonia and David Livingstone managing to create a much more benign society in what became Malawi. And I've got tomorrow my program is about that, and that was one of the chinks of light in British Empire history, the Scottish missionary effort in places like Malawi or Mary Slessor and Calabar. But the Empire, the genocidal tendencies of the British Empire with the Aboriginals, with the Maoris, with the black people in West Africa and taken to the horrors of Caribbean slavery, is an appalling history. And the idea that they managed to preserve this image of being civilized and being benign round the world is just outrageous, because a lot of British colonial history is appalling.
No, absolutely. But it's also unique that if you were to suggest Scottish history being a subject, you would be pilloried. You'd get nationalists, and they would say, it's ridiculous and it's politicising the subject. But it would be the most normal thing in the world, because most other countries do that. You've got your local history and then kind of international history. That could be one of the long-term ideas to sort out the problem.
Yes, and once people know who they are and where they come from and know their literature and history, then it's all normalised, and that's the beginning of being a civilised cultured person in the 21st century. Most of our compatriots haven't had the opportunity to do that. I took every Scottish option available at university, and the knowledge of that literature, for example, gave me the proselytising zeal to want to convert other people and tell them what they'd been missing out on, and therefore why politicians should make decisions to make sure that culture, that brilliant European culture, world culture, should be the centre of the education of Scots in the future.
What do you think about that idea? That it's so bizarre that even suggesting that Scottish history be taught to everyone is considered weirdly political in a way that it wouldn't be in most other places in the world. It's considered, a political act, not an educational activity.
I agree. No, I agree totally. And that has a long pedigree. I remember Professor Barrow, who taught Alex Salmond at St Andrews University, great medievalist, wrote the definitive book on Robert-the-Brucie, and I forget the title just out. I've got it up on my shelf. I need to go and find it. But Professor Barrow's book on Robert-the-Brucie is an absolutely brilliant book. And when he gave his inaugural lecture, he pinpointed that. He gave his, I think the inaugural lecture, I think his first position was in Edinburgh. And his inaugural lecture is a masterpiece considering that very subject. And he quotes people. He cited examples of a number of British politicians suggesting that Scottish history, by its very nature, would be parochial, inward-looking, and irrationally nationalistic. And in his lecture, he refutes that and totally and gives a brilliant speech. One of the ironies I actually find, and I remember after the referendum, Dundee University had a number of very good lectures on before the referendum, and there was a kind of summing up after the referendum. And a group of historians were asked to be a panel, and they spoke about what they thought the effect of the referendum result was, and people asked questions. And one of the questions I asked was, just generally to the historians, was, did they feel that it was a big blow to their subject, the fact that it had been a no vote? And interestingly, the Unionists said no, and the Nationalists in the panel said yes. But I thought the Unionists were being totally disingenuous, because the only reason they've got jobs is because of the upsurge of Scottish nationalism. The upsurge in Scottish historical research and the amount of time and money being available for Scottish historical research and positions in the university to teach Scottish history is a direct result of the rise of modern Scottish nationalism. So you've got Unionist historians teaching Scottish history, and the only reason I think they've got jobs is because we nationalists created the climate where the universities could not refuse to have Scottish content in their history departments. So I found that a bit of an anomaly, and I still find it a bit of an anomaly where you get people in the arts or in history or in areas around Scottish culture who still, fortunately, a diminishing band, I think, politically, who still have unionist tendencies, but often I feel that any success they've had and any profile they've had is usually on the back of the nationalists insisting that for Scotland to be normal, then Scottish history, culture, language, literature had to be taught in our institutes of higher education.
And that's actually a very good note to bring us on to the last question, because you were on the show before, and when it's your first time on the show, you get to choose the song, but this is the second time, so you get to recommend something you think the listeners might enjoy reading. So, what would you choose?
Right. Well, I could suggest a number of novels, and that would be easy, but a harder read, but a very satisfying one, is George Elder Davies' seminal work, The Democratic Intellect. And it seems a very dry subject. It's Scotland and her universities, mainly in the 19th century. But what it is it's the history of the Scottish generalist tradition of studying many subjects so that you've got a wide knowledge of languages, literature, science, etc., and not specialising until much later on with the honours degree. And it's about how the Scottish universities had that generalist tradition, but through Anglicisation and pressure from the British government to toe the line, gradually a balance was struck between the Scottish tradition and the English tradition in the universities. And George Elder Davies details that in fantastic detail and goes into the culture too surrounding it and get marvellous descriptions of that struggle as it went on. And the novel that influenced me most was a novel I got as a prize at school when I was 16, and that was A Scots Square or Sunset Song by Lewis Grassic Gibbon. But I would say that the other work that influenced me most, which I read, I think, when I would be about 20, 21 at university, was The Democratic Intellect by George Elder Davies. So that would be the book that I would will Scottish cultural activists to read.
Okay, thanks for coming on the show again, Billy. That's been great.
Thank you very much, sir. Cheers.
So there you go. That was a conversation with Billy. I hope you enjoyed that. Now, at the beginning of the episode, I promised you a little bonus, or a Robert-the-Brucie bonus, if you will. And, well, this is it.